I want you to know I was doing all the right things. I prayerfully read this text and I put it away for a day, and I just let that text marinate, just like I suggest to students. And only then did I come back and pile the commentaries up on my desk. Only then did I fire up the fantastic electronic resources our library has to offer. I was on a mission, but I was following the procedure. And so I immersed myself in the literary characteristics of the passage, thinking about how this parable is preceded by the Lord's Prayer. And with this parable attached to it, Luke wants to teach us would-be disciples about prayer. Luke wants us to know about the nature of prayer and the reign of God and the Holy Spirit, and just what kind of God receives our prayers. And I began to knock on the interpretive history of the parable. Who has thought what about prayer and the host and the neighbor? And then I land on the social scientific interpretations of the passage. Ooh, I love those. Because we can see how the text frames culture and class and power in historical context. And most of us like to see the text address culture and power and social inequities so that we can talk about the parallels in our own time. And with that lens, I started to read about shame and honor and the practice of hospitality in Jesus' context. And all of that comes into view. And that means that the word that the NRSV translates as persistence comes into play. It's a word used only once in the New Testament, and because of how it's used elsewhere in ancient literature, it's better translated, everyone says, as shamelessness. There is a textual problem, though. We don't know who exactly the shamelessness belongs to. It might be the host, or it might be the neighbor. If it's the host, their midnight knocking risks looking foolish. And the host decides that it's better to forsake their dignity so that they can fulfill the obligations for hospitality. But if it's the reticent neighbor, they only get up and help because, well, if they don't, word will spread and their good reputation will be sullied. I come to a chapter in a book on the parables that was devoted specifically to this parable and this kind of reading. And about halfway through the chapter, the author says, almost all interpreters of the parable agree that the interpretation of the parable hinges on the meaning of the word shamelessness in Luke 11:8. Linked to the question of its meaning is the question of whom it refers to in the parable, to the host or to the neighbor. And I said to myself, ooh, a scholarly disagreement. Who knows? Maybe I was born for such a time as this. And it hits me. By this time, my very best intentions and doing all the right things had carried me away from the scene of the parable itself. Carried me away from the picture that Jesus paints. I had gotten lost in the words on the page, lost in the logic and the history and the details of the text. And in doing so, I had forgotten all about the third character, the hungry traveler, the guest who needed something to eat and a place to lay their head for the night, the text and the search for its meaning. I had allowed all of that to swallow me up. In my quest for the right answer of what the text meant and what it might mean, the parable's person in need had become completely invisible to me. They had faded off into the background and become the least of my concerns. Meanwhile, Hallie rang the doorbell. Hallie always rings the doorbell. Hallie is one of the neighborhood kids in our economically diverse neighborhood here in the North Side. She's 7 or 8 years old and adores my daughter, who is a few years older than Hallie. So Hallie rings the doorbell all the time to see if my daughter can come out and play. And they do. Almost every single day. Coming in and out of the house, in and out of the house, the door opening and closing, eating all the snacks, getting the dog all excited, leaving toys and bits of trash strewn across the yard, spilling the industrial-sized box of goldfish crackers that I never should have bought, and their drinks on the porch, screaming high-pitched screams just for the sake of screaming. If you can't tell, it drives me bonkers. I am glad when they go over to the other side of the street to play, so that I don't have to see them or hear them. I'm even more glad when I turn on the porch light and call in my daughter and announce that playtime for the day is over, and enjoy my peace. And then the other day, after they were done playing, after they had said their goodbyes for the day, just when I had found that peace, when I had settled into my good spot on the couch and turned on my basketball game, the doorbell rang again. Grumbling, I went to answer it. I was ready to shoo Hallie off and remind her that playtime for the day was over. But when I looked through the glass next to the door frame, I could see that tears were streaming down her face and that she was doing that cry breathing thing. And so I opened the door. Hey, Hallie, are you okay? I can't get my door open. You can't get your door open. Oh no, what's happened? They put in a new doorknob and it's hard to get open. Okay. We'll walk down with you and see what we can do about that. Just let me grab my coat real quick. It was freezing outside. So we walked down together and I twist the knob a few times with just a bit more force than an 8-year-old can muster. And the door opens. New doorknob, old door frame. When I walked back down to my house and came in, my spouse, who had been doing something else upstairs, asked me what had happened. I told her. And she looked at me and she said, "You know what that means, right?" I kind of looked back blankly at her. That means that there was no one home to let her in. In my grumbling, I hadn't even considered it. There was no one home to let this little girl in. And in my shame, all I had wanted her to do was fade away. It's funny how parables work. We feel like we're supposed to work on them and work on them and work on them until we get them just right. And we should. But even more, they're supposed to work on us until they make us right.